Hello, and welcome to History Sleep Stories. Tonight, we're going on a journey, not just to a different place, but to a different time. We're traveling back thousands of years, long before pyramids, before Stonehenge, before written history even began. We're going to a place that holds a special title, one of the very first places on Earth where humans decided to stop wandering and start building a life that would change our world forever. We're exploring the story of Jericho, a strong candidate for humanity's earliest city. This isn't a story of kings and empires, but of ordinary people and their extraordinary ideas. It's a story told not by ancient books, but by the very ground itself, uncovered by archaeologists one careful layer at a time. So, get comfortable, and let's step back in time to the dawn of civilization. The oasis in the desert. Why here? The story of Jericho begins with something very simple and absolutely essential for life: water. If you were to look at a map of the Middle East, you would see a long, thin valley running north to south. This is the Jordan Valley, part of a much larger crack in the Earth's crust, known as the Great Rift Valley. This area is mostly dry, a rugged landscape where survival would have been a constant challenge for ancient people. But right in the middle of this valley, just north of the Dead Sea, is a spot of incredible green. This is an oasis, fed by a perpetual and powerful spring. Today it's called the Ain as-Sultan Spring. For thousands of years, it has gushed out fresh, clean water, creating a small but very fertile paradise in the middle of a harsh environment. This spring is the entire reason Jericho exists. Think about it from the perspective of a group of people living over 10,000 years ago. These people were hunter-gatherers. This means their life was based on moving from place to place. They followed the animals they hunted and searched for wild plants, nuts, and fruits that were in season. Their life was one of constant motion, carrying their few belongings with them. There were no permanent houses, no farms, and no villages. The world was their home, but it was a home that demanded endless travel. Now, imagine these people discovering the Ain as-Sultan Spring. It wasn't just a puddle of water. It was a reliable, year-round source. In a dry land, this was like finding a gold mine. The water from the spring allowed a rich variety of plants to grow: wild fig trees, date palms, and all sorts of grasses and reeds. Animals, from small gazelles to wild boar, would have come to the spring to drink, making it a perfect hunting ground. For hunter-gatherers, this place would have been a magnet. It was a natural rest stop, a place where different groups might meet, and a location so rich in resources that they might have stayed for much longer periods than anywhere else. But something bigger happened here. At some point, around 10,000 years ago, a group of people didn't just camp near the spring for a season. They decided to settle down. They began to build permanent structures. This shift from a nomadic lifestyle to a settled one is one of the most important changes in all of human history. It's called the Neolithic Revolution. And Jericho is one of the very best places in the world to see how this revolution began. Why did they choose to stay? The water was the main reason, but the location offered other advantages. The Jordan Valley, while dry, has a warmer climate than the hills and mountains around it, which was good for living year-round. The soil near the spring, regularly enriched by floods and the constant water supply, was very good for plants. While these first settlers weren't farmers yet, they were living in a place that had the potential for it. They were also in a position to control a valuable resource. Other groups traveling through the valley would have needed to access the water, which may have given the settled group a certain amount of influence or power. So, the stage was set. The actors were a group of Neolithic people who had grown tired of, or saw an advantage in ending, their wandering life. The setting was a lush, green oasis, a beacon of life in a challenging landscape. The simple decision to stay put, to build something meant to last, was the first step on the long road to the world we live in today. The story of the city was about to begin, not with a bang, but with a quiet, deliberate construction of the very first houses. The first settlers, the Natufians and their stone towers, the very first people to build permanent structures at Jericho, were not the ones we typically think of as city builders. They belonged to a culture that archaeologists call the Natufians. The Natufians were still hunter-gatherers, but they were what is known as sedentary or semi-sedentary hunter-gatherers. This is a key difference. Instead of moving all the time, they established base camps, places they would return to year after year, and where they might live for many months at a time. They were on the cusp of a major change. At Jericho, the Natufians didn't just camp, they built. The evidence for this comes from the very bottom layers of the ancient mound, known as a tell. A tell is a hill created by thousands of years of people building on top of the ruins of previous generations. When one mud brick house fell down or was destroyed, people would simply level the rubble and build a new one on top. Over centuries, this process creates an artificial hill, layer upon layer, like a history book made of earth. The deepest layers at Jericho show the remains of Natufian structures. These early buildings were simple, round, or oval huts. They were often semi-subterranean, meaning they were dug partly into the ground. This provided better insulation against the heat of the day and the cool of the night. The walls were probably made of a framework of branches, covered with mud. They would have had simple thatched roofs. A village of these huts would have been established near the life-giving spring. Life for these people was still based on hunting the animals that came to the water and gathering the wild plants that grew there. But by having a permanent home base, they were able to start accumulating things: better grinding stones for processing wild grains, more sophisticated tools, and storage pits for keeping food for longer. But the most amazing thing the early people of Jericho did, the thing that truly marks it as a special place, was to build a massive stone wall in a huge, mysterious stone tower. This happened around 9,000 years ago, in a period we call the Pre-Pottery Neolithic A, or PPNA. This was a time before people had invented pottery, but they were becoming more and more settled. The Wall of Jericho is one of the oldest known defensive structures in the world. It wasn't a small fence. The base of this wall was a massive stone construction, over 1.8 meters, almost 6 feet thick, and preserved in some places to a height of 3.7 meters, 12 feet. It would have been even taller when it was first built. Building this wall was an enormous community effort. It required people to organize, to quarry large stones, to transport them, and to fit them together. This tells us that the society at Jericho was already quite complex. They had a shared goal and the leadership, or social structure, to see it through. Even more impressive is the tower. Built inside the wall, against its inner face, is a massive stone tower. It is conical in shape, about 8.5 meters, 28 feet, high, with an internal staircase of 22 stone steps. This is the oldest known stone tower in the world. Why did they build it? That is one of the great mysteries of Jericho. For a long time, archaeologists thought it was purely for defense, a lookout post to see enemies approaching. But some recent theories suggest it might have had a symbolic or religious purpose. The staircase inside is steep and narrow, not very practical for a quick military response. Furthermore, the wall itself seems to have protected the settlement from the north and west, but not fully from the south, where the spring is located. This has led some to think the wall might have been as much for protection against floods and mudflows from the nearby hills as it was for defense against human enemies. The tower might have been a symbol of the community's power and unity, a permanent marker in the landscape saying, "We are here, and we built this." Whatever its purpose, the tower stands as a stunning achievement. It is proof that nearly 10,000 years ago, the people of Jericho were capable of sophisticated engineering and large-scale, coordinated labor. They were not just surviving, they were building a monument. Life in the early town, houses, skulls, and daily grind. So, what was life actually like inside these formidable walls around 9,000 years ago? The people of Jericho at this time, known as the Pre-Pottery Neolithic PPNA, people had created a settlement that was unlike anything seen before. It was a dense collection of homes, housing perhaps a few thousand people, a huge population for that time. To understand them, we need to look at their houses, their food, and their strange and fascinating spiritual beliefs. The houses of early Jericho were very different from the round huts of the earlier Natufians. They were now rectangular, a shape that is more efficient for arranging furniture and dividing space. The construction method was advanced. They built their houses using a technique with mud bricks. But these weren't just any mud bricks. They were hog-backed bricks, which were curved on the top surface. The bricks were molded from mud and straw, and then sun-dried until they were hard. The walls were then plastered with a smooth layer of mud, both inside and out, to make them weatherproof and more attractive. Inside, the floors were the real masterpiece. They were made of a fine, lime-based plaster. This plaster was manufactured by burning limestone in a kiln to create quicklime, then mixing it with water to create a smooth paste. This was a complex, energy-intensive process. The plaster was applied smoothly to the floors, and then often burnished or polished with stones until it was hard and shiny, almost like a terrazzo floor. These floors were sometimes tinted with red ochre, giving them a reddish-pink color. The walls might also have been plastered and painted. Imagine the interior of one of these houses. Clean, smooth, painted floors and walls, a stark contrast to the dusty world outside. It shows a people who cared about their living space, who valued cleanliness and order, and who had the technical knowledge to create a comfortable home. What did they eat? We have to remember, this was still before the full development of agriculture. The people of PPNA Jericho were not full-time farmers. They were what we call broad-spectrum foragers. This means they exploited a very wide range of food sources. They hunted gazelle, wild boar, cattle, and fox. They trapped birds and fished in the nearby river and spring. They gathered a huge variety of wild plants, pulses like wild lentils, cereals like wild barley and emmer wheat, nuts like pistachios and acorns, and fruits like figs and dates. They used heavy stone mortar and pestles to grind the wild grains into flour, which they could then bake into a simple flatbread. Their diet was varied, and thanks to the rich oasis environment, relatively reliable. Now, we come to one of the most famous and eerie discoveries at Jericho, the plastered skulls. The people of Jericho had a very unique way of treating their dead. They would bury their deceased family members under the floors of their own houses. This was a common practice, linking the family to their ancestors. But sometimes they would later come back to the grave, carefully remove the skull, and take it. They would then model a face onto the skull using plaster. They would fill in the eye sockets with plaster, and sometimes put seashells in to represent the eyes. They would model a nose, mouth, and ears, trying to recreate the likeness of the dead person. Why did they do this? Archaeologists believe this was a form of ancestor worship. By preserving the skull and giving it a face, they were keeping the memory and perhaps the spirit of the ancestor present in the home. These plastered skulls have been found stored in special niches in the walls or under the floors. It suggests that the people of Jericho had a complex belief system about life, death, and the afterlife. They believed that their ancestors continued to play a role in their lives, perhaps as protectors or guides. This practice tells us that their society was not just organized on a practical level for building walls. It was also organized on a spiritual level, with shared rituals and beliefs that bound the community together. Life in early Jericho was a mix of the very practical building strong houses, finding food, and the deeply spiritual, honoring the dead to ensure the well-being of the living. A changing world the pre-pottery Neolithic B revolution. After several centuries, the culture at Jericho changed. Around 8,500 years ago, a new wave of people, or perhaps new ideas that were adopted by the existing population, transformed the town. Archaeologists call this new phase the pre-pottery Neolithic B, or PPNB. This was not a small change. It was a revolution in how people lived, built, and thought. The PPNB period saw Jericho grow and evolve, adopting new technologies and social customs that would spread across the ancient Near East. One of the most noticeable changes was in architecture. The people of the PPNB period stopped using the curved, hog-backed bricks of their predecessors. Instead, they began making standard, rectangular mud bricks. These were easier to stack and created straighter, more uniform walls. But the biggest architectural shift was in the layout of the houses. PPNB houses were much larger and more complex. They were typically rectangular, with multiple rooms. The main room was often a large, open living space. The floors were still made of the fine, burnished lime plaster, but they were now often divided into different levels or platforms, suggesting different areas for different activities, like sleeping, cooking, and working. A key feature of these new houses was the introduction of plaster-lined basins set into the floor. These were likely used for storage, perhaps for grain or other dry goods. They also had sophisticated hearths and ovens for cooking and heating. The doors of these houses were also different. Instead of a simple opening, they now often had raised thresholds, a step up to get inside. This would have helped keep out dust and water. The overall impression is of a society that was becoming more sophisticated in its domestic life, valuing privacy, specialized spaces, and cleanliness. The most significant change, however, was in the economy. During the PPNB period, the people of Jericho fully embraced agriculture. They were no longer just gathering wild grains. They were now cultivating them. Archaeologists have found evidence of domesticated forms of barley, emmer wheat, and lentils. They were also beginning to practice animal domestication. While they still hunted gazelle and other wild animals, they were now herding domesticated goats. This shift from hunting to herding and from gathering to farming is the final, crucial step in the Neolithic Revolution. Why is this such a big deal? Farming and herding provided a more reliable and predictable food supply. People could now produce food, not just find it. This led to a population boom. A farming society can support many more people in a small area than a hunter-gatherer society can. With a surplus of food, not everyone had to be involved in food production. This allowed for the development of specialists, people who were expert tool makers, plaster workers, basket weavers, or perhaps early priests or leaders. Society became more complex and stratified. This new way of life also changed their relationship with the outside world. Jericho was no longer an isolated village. It was part of a vast network of trade and exchange that stretched across hundreds of miles. How do we know this? Because archaeologists have found objects at PPNB Jericho made from materials that are not local. They found obsidian, a volcanic glass used to make very sharp tools that came from central Turkey. They found seashells from the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. They even found semi-precious stones like turquoise and malachite. This tells us that the people of Jericho were connected. They were trading their own goods, perhaps salt from the Dead Sea, or bitumen, a natural tar, or food surpluses for these exotic items. This trade brought not just goods, but also new ideas, new technologies, and new people to Jericho, making it a dynamic and cosmopolitan center for its time. The town was now firmly established as a major player in the emerging world of the Neolithic. The mysterious decline. What happened to the Neolithic town? The great flourishing of Jericho during the PPNB period did not last forever. After several hundred years of prosperity and growth, the town went into a period of decline. By around 7,000 years ago, the vibrant, sophisticated settlement was largely abandoned. The grand plastered houses fell into ruin. The population seems to have dwindled to almost nothing, or perhaps they left altogether. This was not a sudden, violent end like the famous biblical story of the walls tumbling down from a trumpet blast. This was a slower, more gradual fading. So, what happened? Why did one of the world's first and most successful towns seemingly fail? Archaeologists don't have a single clear answer. There is no evidence of a massive invasion or a catastrophic fire that destroyed the town. Instead, they point to a combination of factors, likely involving both environmental change and shifts in human society. One major theory is climate change. The Neolithic period was a time of shifting weather patterns. The early Holocene epoch, when Jericho was founded, was generally warmer and wetter than the ice age that came before it. This climatic optimum is what made the area so hospitable in the first place. However, evidence from ice cores and lake sediments suggests that around 6,200 BCE, there was a sharp, global cold and dry period that lasted for over a century. This is known as the 8.2 kiloyear event. For a place like Jericho, which relied on a spring and local rainfall for its agriculture, a long-term drought would have been devastating. The water flow from the Ain as Sultan spring might have decreased. The rains that watered their crops would have failed. The hunting would have become poorer as animals moved away or died out. A prolonged drought could have made it impossible to support a large, concentrated population. The very environmental advantage that created Jericho may have temporarily disappeared. Another factor was likely the overuse of the local environment. Supporting a town of several thousand people puts a huge strain on local resources. The people of Jericho needed vast amounts of wood for fuel for cooking, for heating, for making plaster, which requires burning limestone at high temperatures. Over centuries, they would have cut down the trees for miles around. Deforestation leads to soil erosion. When the trees are gone, the soil washes away when it rains, making the land less fertile for farming. They also needed clay for their millions of mud bricks. The combination of deforestation and intensive farming could have degraded the land, reducing its ability to produce food, just as the climate was becoming drier. There is also evidence of a cultural and social collapse. The unique traditions of the PPNB people, like the plastered skulls and the fine plaster floors, disappeared. The later layers show a much simpler material culture. This suggests that the social structure that organized the large-scale construction projects and complex rituals broke down. Perhaps the ruling elders or priests lost their authority when times got tough. Maybe the community lost faith in their ancestors and gods when their prayers for rain went unanswered. When a society's belief system collapses, it can be just as damaging as an environmental disaster. It's also possible that people simply moved. The decline of Jericho coincides with the rise of other settlements in the region. As farming knowledge spread, other communities in better watered areas, like the hills of the West Bank or further north in Syria, may have become more attractive. The people of Jericho, facing hard times at home, may have gradually dispersed, joining other villages or starting new ones. The end of PPNB Jericho was probably not one single event, but a perfect storm of environmental stress, resource depletion, and social change. The great experiment of urban living had, for the moment, paused, but the story of Jericho was far from over. The long gap in new beginnings, the Chalcolithic period, for several centuries after the collapse of the PPNB town, the mound of Jericho was only sparsely occupied. There is evidence of some small-scale habitation, but nothing like the thriving town of before. It was as if the land needed to rest, to recover from the intensive use of the previous 2,000 years. This quiet period is what archaeologists call a hiatus, but eventually, people returned, and with them came new technologies and new ways of life. The next major phase of occupation at Jericho is known as the Chalcolithic period, which means Copper Stone Age. It was a time when people were still using stone tools primarily, but they had begun to experiment with metal, specifically copper. The Chalcolithic period at Jericho, beginning around 4500 BCE, looks very different from the Neolithic periods that came before. The people were still farmers, growing wheat, barley, and legumes, and herding goats, sheep, and cattle. But their material culture had changed dramatically. One of the most significant inventions of this period was pottery. For the first time, people were making fired clay pots and vessels. This was a major technological leap. Pottery is fragile, but it is also incredibly versatile. It allows for the easy storage of dry goods and liquids. It allows for cooking directly over a fire, making it easier to prepare soups and stews. It enables the fermentation of foods and drinks. The invention of pottery revolutionized daily life. The pottery found at Chalcolithic Jericho is simple but functional. It is often handmade, not made on a potter's wheel, and decorated with simple, painted bands or patterns in red ochre. The shapes include large storage jars, medium-sized pots for cooking, and bowls for serving and eating. The presence of pottery also gives archaeologists a huge advantage. Pottery styles change quickly and are distinct to different cultures and time periods. By studying the pottery, archaeologists can track trade, cultural influence, and the relative date of a layer much more easily than with stone tools alone. The houses of the Chalcolithic period were also different. They were simpler than the multi-roomed, plaster-floored houses of the PPNB. They were often semi-subterranean, dug partly into the ground, much like the very first Natchavian huts, but usually rectangular in shape. The walls were made of mud brick or wattle and daub, a framework of branches covered with mud. The floors were usually just beaten earth, not the fine plaster of before. This doesn't mean the people were less advanced. It just means they had different priorities and a different social structure. They may not have felt the need, or had the centralized organization, for such elaborate, labor-intensive homes. One of the most interesting aspects of the Chalcolithic period is the evidence for new religious beliefs and practices. While the people of this time did not continue the tradition of plastering human skulls, they did leave behind other fascinating artifacts. They made small, clay figurines, often of animals or stylized human forms. They also began using caves in the surrounding hills as burial places. In these caves, archaeologists have found ossuaries boxes made of clay or stone that were used to hold the bones of the dead after the flesh had decayed. Some of these ossuaries are shaped like houses, with lids that look like roofs, perhaps symbolizing a house for the dead. This shows a continued and evolving concern with the afterlife and the treatment of ancestors. Life in Chalcolithic Jericho was quieter and more modest than during its Neolithic peak. It was a farming village, not a major fortified town. But it was an important link in the chain. The people of this era were innovators, mastering pottery and taking the first steps into metallurgy. They were keeping the site alive, maintaining the connection to this special location with its perpetual spring. They were the bridge between the glorious early experiment of the Neolithic and the even more complex urban societies that were just over the horizon. The foundation was being laid for Jericho's next great chapter. The Bronze Age city, walls, warriors, and trade, as the Chalcolithic period transitioned into the early Bronze Age, beginning around 3600 BCE, Jericho once again rose to prominence. The small farming village transformed back into a fortified, influential town. This was part of a wider trend across the region, often called the Urban Revolution. Across the Levant and Mesopotamia, cities were springing up, with complex societies, powerful rulers, and extensive trade networks. Jericho, with its strategic location and reliable water source, was perfectly positioned to be a key player in this new world. The most obvious sign of Jericho's renewed importance was the return of massive fortifications. The early Bronze Age people constructed a new formidable defensive system. This included a great wall, built from stone and mud brick, that surrounded the town. But the defensive system was more sophisticated than the simple stone wall of the Neolithic. It often consisted of two parallel walls, with the space between them filled with rubble and dirt, creating a massive, sloping rampart that was very difficult to attack. At the base of this rampart was a large, rock-cut ditch, adding another layer of defense. Building these fortifications required a huge amount of organized labor, indicating that a powerful central authority, perhaps a king or a council of elders, was in charge. Why did they need such strong walls? The Bronze Age was a more competitive and dangerous time. Wealth was accumulating in cities, making them targets for raiders and rival city-states. Jericho, controlling a valuable oasis and trade routes, would have needed to protect itself. The walls were a statement of power and a practical necessity for survival. Life inside these walls was bustling. The town was densely packed with houses, workshops, and storage buildings. The houses were now typically multi-roomed, built around central courtyards. This layout provided privacy and a safe outdoor space for families. The economy of Bronze Age Jericho was diverse and connected. Farming was still the base, but now they were cultivating grapes and olives in addition to grains. This is significant because grapes and olives can be turned into wine and oil products that can be stored for a long time and traded over long distances. Jericho likely became a producer and exporter of these valuable goods. Trade was a major source of wealth. Jericho's location was a natural stopping point for trade caravans moving between Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia, modern Turkey. Archaeological finds prove these connections. In Bronze Age layers, archaeologists have found Egyptian artifacts, including pottery, stone vessels, and scarabs, small amulets. They have also found cylinder seals from Mesopotamia, which were used to mark ownership of goods. This means that merchants and diplomats from these great civilizations were passing through Jericho, trading their goods for local products. The people of Jericho were no longer isolated. They were part of an international system. They would have heard news from Egypt and stories from Mesopotamia. Their leaders would have worn imported jewelry and used fine imported pottery to display their status. Society in Bronze Age Jericho was almost certainly hierarchical. There was a ruling elite who organized the defense and trade. There were skilled artisans, potters, metalworkers, weavers, and carpenters. There were merchants who managed the trade. And there were farmers and laborers who formed the majority of the population. This social stratification is a hallmark of a true city. Jericho, during its Bronze Age peak, was no longer just a large village. It was an urban center with a complex, layered society, deeply engaged with the wider world. It was a city in every sense of the word, a worthy successor to its Neolithic ancestor. The Middle Bronze Age. Jericho's powerful fortifications, the Middle Bronze Age, from about 2000 to 1550 BCE, represents the peak of Jericho's power and prosperity as a Canaanite city-state. After a period of decline at the end of the early Bronze Age, urban life rebounded with even greater strength. The cities of this era were larger, richer, and more heavily fortified than ever before. Jericho was no exception. The defensive walls built during this period were so massive that their remains would have been visible for centuries, likely inspiring the later biblical stories. The fortification system of Middle Bronze Age Jericho was a masterpiece of military engineering. It was designed to withstand the most determined attacks, including the use of battering rams and siege ramps. The core of the defense was a massive sloping rampart. This wasn't just a wall. It was an artificial mountain of earth and rubble, faced with a layer of plaster or stones to make it hard to climb. At the bottom of this rampart was a deep, plaster-lined ditch, or fosse, which would stop attackers and their siege engines from getting close to the main wall. On top of this earthen rampart stood the main defensive wall. This was a towering structure made of mud bricks on a stone foundation. It was incredibly thick. Archaeologists found one section that was 4 meters, over 13 feet, thick. At regular intervals along this wall, there were massive square towers that projected outward. These towers allowed defenders to shoot arrows or throw stones at the sides of any attackers who managed to reach the base of the wall. The main gate of the city would have been a complex, heavily guarded structure with multiple chambers and gates, designed to be a death trap for any enemy who tried to force their way in. Building this system was an almost unimaginable effort. It required moving thousands of tons of earth and stone, manufacturing millions of mud bricks, and organizing a workforce of hundreds, if not thousands, of people over many years. This tells us that the ruler of Middle Bronze Age Jericho had immense power and control over the population. He could command this labor for the collective defense and to display his own power. The walls were a symbol of the city's strength and a clear warning to any potential enemy. Life inside this fortress was prosperous. The city was well planned, with houses, palaces, and temples. The rulers and elite lived in large, multi-roomed buildings, often 2 stories high, with plastered walls and floors. They owned luxury goods from across the ancient world, including beautifully crafted pottery, bronze weapons and tools, and gold and silver jewelry. Trade with Egypt and other regions was at its height. Jericho was a wealthy city, controlling the trade routes through the Jordan Valley and producing agricultural surpluses from its fertile lands. This was the Jericho that would have existed at the time the Bible places the story of Joshua. The archaeological picture, however, is complex. The excavations led by Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s showed that this mighty Middle Bronze Age city was destroyed by a violent conflagration around 1550 BCE. She found layers of ash and burned mud bricks. This destruction is generally attributed to the Egyptians, as the pharaohs of the early New Kingdom campaigned vigorously into Canaan to expel the Hyksos rulers and re-establish Egyptian control. This destruction marked the end of Jericho's time as a major fortified city-state for several centuries. The Great Walls, which had stood for hundreds of years, were shattered and buried, leaving behind a much smaller and poorer settlement. The memory of those immense walls, however, lived on in local tradition, eventually finding its way into one of the most famous stories ever told. The Late Bronze Age, a smaller settlement, and the biblical question. The period after the destruction of the mighty Middle Bronze Age city, from about 1550 to 1200 BCE, is known as the Late Bronze Age. This was a time of great empires. Egypt firmly controlled Canaan, administering it as a province and building garrison cities to maintain power and collect taxes. In this new political landscape, Jericho's role changed dramatically. The archaeological evidence suggests that during most of the Late Bronze Age, Jericho was a very small, relatively poor, and unfortified settlement. The excavations at Jericho have been central to a major historical debate. The story of the Israelite conquest of Canaan, as described in the book of Joshua in the Bible. According to the biblical narrative, after the death of Moses, the Israelite leader Joshua led the people across the Jordan River, and their first major target was the powerful city of Jericho. The story describes a miraculous event. The Israelite army marched around the city for 7 days. The priests blew their trumpets, and the mighty walls of the city collapsed, allowing the Israelites to capture and destroy it. The key question for archaeologists and historians is, does the archaeological evidence support this story? The most detailed archaeological work on this period at Jericho was done by the British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s. Her findings were very clear. She determined that the great defensive walls of Jericho dated to the Middle Bronze Age, and that they had been destroyed around 1550 BCE in the massive fire likely set by the Egyptians. After that destruction, the city was largely abandoned for a long time. When people did return, it was only a small settlement. Kenyon found very little evidence of a significant Late Bronze Age city at all. There were no massive fortifications from this period. The settlement was small and unimpressive. Most importantly, she found no evidence of a large, destructive conquest around the time the Bible places Joshua's attack, which would be sometime in the late 13th century BCE. Based on her meticulous analysis of the pottery and layers, she concluded that there was no great city for Joshua to conquer at that time. The Jericho of the Late Bronze Age was, in her words, small and unimportant, and it was already in ruins by the end of the 14th century BCE, before the Israelites supposedly arrived. This created a major problem for those who read the Bible as a straightforward historical account. If there were no great walls in the late 13th century BCE, then the famous story of the walls tumbling down could not have happened as described. Some scholars have argued against Kenyon's conclusions, suggesting that erosion may have washed away the evidence from the Late Bronze Age, or that her dating was slightly off. However, the general consensus among archaeologists is that the evidence does not support the existence of a heavily fortified city at Jericho at the time of Joshua. So, where did the story come from? Most likely, it is an ideological story, a tale invented to explain a famous ruin. The massive, tumbled walls of the Middle Bronze Age city would have been a prominent feature of the landscape for centuries after its destruction. People living in the area later, including the early Israelites, would have seen these ruins and wondered what giant event could have caused such destruction. The story of Joshua and the trumpets provides a dramatic and divinely powered explanation for these awesome ruins. The biblical story likely preserves a folk memory of the city's past greatness and its dramatic fall, but it attributes that fall to a different cause in a later time. The historical reality is that Jericho in the Late Bronze Age was a shadow of its former self, a small town under the thumb of the Egyptian Empire. The Iron Age, a town in the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, after the collapse of the Great Bronze Age empires around 1200 BCE. A new era began, the Iron Age. This period saw the rise of new peoples and new kingdoms in the region, most notably the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. During this time, Jericho re-emerged from its long period of obscurity and became a settled town once again. While it never regained the immense size and power it held in the Middle Bronze Age, it became an important regional center thanks to its enduring advantages, the spring and its strategic location. The Bible mentions Jericho several times during the Iron Age, not as a conquered city, but as a functioning Israelite town. It is described as a city of palms, highlighting its continued identity as a fertile oasis. According to the first book of Kings, the town was rebuilt by a man named Heel of Bethel during the reign of King Ahab in the 9th century BCE. The biblical text says, "He laid its foundation at the cost of Abiram, his firstborn, and set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son Segub." This is a strange and dark statement, which some interpreters think might be a reference to a foundation sacrifice, a practice known in some ancient cultures, though there is no archaeological evidence for this at Jericho. Archaeologically, the evidence for Iron Age Jericho is clearer than for the Late Bronze Age. Excavations have uncovered the remains of a modest but well-built settlement. The houses from this period are typical of Israelite architecture. They are often referred to as four-room houses. This was a common design, a rectangular building divided into 3 or 4 long rooms running parallel to each other, with a broad room across the back. The central room was often an open courtyard. This design was practical, providing space for people, animals, and storage all under one roof. The walls were made of rough stone foundations with mud brick superstructures. The town was likely surrounded by a simple defensive wall, but nothing like the colossal fortifications of the Middle Bronze Age. Its importance was more economic than military. Jericho was a center for the production of two very valuable commodities, dates and balsam. The date palms from the Jericho oasis were famous for their quality and sweetness. Even more valuable was the balsam plant, from which a very expensive perfume and medicinal resin were extracted. This balm of Gilead was a major export and source of wealth for the kingdom of Judah, which controlled Jericho for much of this period. Jericho's location also made it a key administrative point. It guarded the eastern approaches to the central hill country, where the capitals of Israel and later Judah were located. It was also a crossing point for the Jordan River, making it a gateway for trade and travel between the territories east and west of the river. Control of Jericho meant control of this important route. The town seems to have been destroyed in the early 6th century BCE, probably during the Babylonian campaigns that ultimately led to the destruction of the kingdom of Judah and Jerusalem in 586 BCE. After this destruction, Jericho entered another period of decline, but its story was not over. Its strategic and economic value was too great for it to remain abandoned for long. The pattern of rise, fall, and rebirth that defines Jericho's long history was about to repeat itself once more under new empires and new rulers. Under imperial rule, the Persians, Greeks, and Romans. After the Babylonian destruction, Jericho lay in ruins for a time. But with the rise of the Persian Empire in the 6th century BCE, which conquered Babylon and took control of the entire region, the area saw a revival. The Persians had a policy of encouraging the return of exiled peoples and the rebuilding of local centers to promote stability and tax revenue. While Jericho itself was not a major city at this time, the surrounding area was repopulated. The real transformation of Jericho in the post-biblical era began with the arrival of the Greeks and Romans. When Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire in the late 4th century BCE, he brought the entire region into the sphere of Greek culture, a period known as the Hellenistic Age. The successors to Alexander's empire, the Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucids of Syria, fought over this valuable territory. During this time, a new settlement was established about 2 kilometers south of the ancient mound, or tell. This shift in location was likely because the new rulers wanted a fresh, planned city, not built on centuries of older ruins. But it was under Roman rule, starting in the 1st century BCE, that Jericho truly flourished again as a luxurious winter resort. The Roman client king, Herod the Great, who ruled Judea on Rome's behalf, fell in love with the site. He recognized its potential. The warm winter climate of the Jordan Valley was a welcome escape from the cold and rain of Jerusalem, which is at a much higher altitude. Herod built a magnificent winter palace complex at Jericho. This was not a single building, but a sprawling estate of palaces, gardens, pools, and entertainment facilities. Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of Herod's Jericho. The palaces were built with the typical Roman grandeur, featuring mosaic floors, elaborate bathhouses with hot and cold pools, and colonnaded courtyards. He built a massive hippodrome for chariot races and other games. To service his lavish gardens and swimming pools, he constructed an elaborate aqueduct system to bring even more water from the nearby Wadi Kelt, supplementing the water from the Ain Sultan Spring. Herod's building projects show the continued economic importance of Jericho. The date and balsam plantations remained incredibly profitable. In fact, the balsam groves were so valuable that they were considered a personal possession of the emperor in Rome after Herod's death. They were a state monopoly, producing a product that was worth twice its weight in silver. Jericho was essentially a royal estate, a center of agricultural industry and luxurious living. After Herod's death and the eventual Roman takeover of direct rule, Jericho continued to be an important administrative and military center. A Roman garrison was stationed there to guard the strategic route and the valuable plantations. The city was part of the vast Roman road network, connecting it to Jerusalem and other cities in the region. For several centuries under Roman and later Byzantine rule, Jericho prospered as a market town and a stop for pilgrims traveling to the Jordan River, which was believed to be the site of Jesus' baptism. The city had come full circle, from a Neolithic farming town to a Canaanite city-state to a Roman-era center of luxury and trade. Its survival always anchored by the constant, life-giving water of the spring. The Byzantine and Islamic periods, a changing landscape with the division of the Roman Empire, the land of Israel, including Jericho, became part of the Eastern Roman, or Byzantine, Empire. This was a Christian empire, and the new state religion had a profound effect on Jericho and the entire region. The city was no longer a royal pleasure palace, but it gained new importance as a religious site and a stop on the pilgrimage trail. Christian tradition associated the area around Jericho with several events from the Bible, both the Old and New Testaments. The most important was the nearby Jordan River, which was venerated as the site where John the Baptist baptized Jesus. Pilgrims from all over the Byzantine Empire would travel to the Holy Land to visit Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and the Jordan River. Jericho, located on the road from Jerusalem down to the river, became a natural stopping point for these pilgrims. They needed places to stay, eat, and worship. As a result, several churches and monasteries were built in and around Jericho during the Byzantine period, 4th to 7th centuries CE. Monasteries were carved into the cliffs of the nearby Judean desert, housing monks who sought solitude and spiritual reflection. A vibrant community developed to support the pilgrimage economy. The date and sugarcane plantations, replacing the ancient balsam, continued to be a source of wealth for the town. This Christian phase of Jericho's history came to an end in the 7th century with the rise of Islam. Arab armies, inspired by the new faith, conquered the region from the Byzantine Empire. The new rulers were Muslims, but they were generally tolerant of Christians and Jews, allowing them to practice their religion in exchange for a special tax. Under Islamic rule, Jericho's name reverted to its Semitic root, Araya. Its strategic and economic value ensured its survival. The Umayyad caliphs, who ruled the Islamic Empire from Damascus in the 7th and 8th centuries, took a personal interest in Jericho, much like Herod had. They built luxurious palace complexes in the area, not just in Jericho itself, but also at nearby sites like Khurbat al-Mafjar, just north of the town. This palace, built by a nephew of the caliph, is one of the most spectacular early Islamic archaeological sites. It featured a grand reception hall, a mosque, bathhouses with incredibly detailed and colorful mosaic and stucco decorations, and a huge courtyard. The ruins show a level of artistry and luxury that rivals the Roman and Byzantine buildings. These palaces were likely used as agricultural estates and winter retreats for the ruling elite, continuing the pattern set by Herod. They enjoyed the warm climate and the beautiful surroundings. However, this period of prosperity was cut short. In 749 CE, a massive earthquake struck the region, completely destroying the Umayyad palace at Khurbat al-Mafjar before it was even fully completed. The earthquake also caused widespread damage throughout Jericho and the wider Jordan Valley. This natural disaster, combined with political shifts as the capital of the Islamic Empire moved from Damascus to Baghdad, led to another period of decline for Jericho. For several centuries, it returned to being a small, relatively unimportant village, its days of royal patronage once again a memory buried in the sand. The Crusader interlude and Mamluk rule. After the earthquake of 749 CE and the move of the Islamic Caliphate's power center to Baghdad, Jericho faded into obscurity for several centuries. It was a small, insignificant village under the control of various Islamic dynasties. This changed briefly in the 12th century with the arrival of the Crusaders from Europe. The Crusaders were Christian knights and soldiers who launched military campaigns to capture the Holy Land from Muslim rule. they established a Christian kingdom centered in Jerusalem. For the Crusaders, Jericho held both strategic and religious significance. It was located in a vulnerable part of their kingdom, on the road from Jerusalem down to the Jordan River and the Dead Sea. They also recognized its biblical importance. To secure the area and protect pilgrims traveling to the Jordan River, which they also venerated as the site of Jesus' baptism, the Crusaders built a small fort and a church in Jericho. They also cultivated the sugar cane that grew so well in the hot climate, building mills to process the cane into sugar, which was a valuable luxury commodity in medieval Europe. However, Crusader control of Jericho was short-lived. In 1187, Muslim leader Saladin decisively defeated the Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin. In the aftermath of this victory, Saladin's forces quickly recaptured most of the Crusader kingdom, including Jericho. The Crusader structures were largely destroyed or abandoned. The end of the Crusader period ushered in a new era of Islamic rule, first under the Ayyubids, Saladin's dynasty, and then, more significantly, under the Mamluks. The Mamluks were a slave soldier dynasty that ruled Egypt and Syria from the 13th to the 16th centuries. They were great builders and administrators. Under the Mamluks, Jericho experienced a modest revival. The Mamluks repaired the roads and built bridges to facilitate travel and trade across their empire. They also built caravanserais, large inns that provided lodging, food, and water for merchants and their caravans. One such caravanserai was built in Jericho to serve travelers on the route between Jerusalem and Damascus. While Jericho was not a major city under the Mamluks, it was a stable and functioning administrative center within the district of Jerusalem. Its agricultural production, particularly of dates and sugar, continued. The Mamluk period was a time of consolidation. The town was fully integrated into the Islamic world, and its role as a way station on an important travel route was firmly established. This laid the groundwork for its development in the next great imperial period, the rule of the Ottoman Turks. The cycle of Jericho's history continued a period of decline, followed by a period of rebuilding and a finding of a new, if more modest, purpose. The Ottoman era and the modern rediscovery from the early 16th century until the end of World War I. The entire region, including Jericho, was part of the vast Ottoman Empire, ruled from Constantinople, modern Istanbul. For much of this long period, Jericho remained a small, sleepy village. Ottoman tax records from the 16th century describe it as a tiny settlement of just a few dozen families. The grand palaces and fortified walls were long gone, and the people lived in simple mud brick houses clustered around the ancient spring. The primary economy was still based on agriculture, focusing on the famous date palms and also cultivating bananas and citrus fruits. The village was part of the administrative district of Jerusalem, but it was far from the center of power. For centuries, it was a quiet backwater, visited occasionally by a few adventurous travelers and pilgrims. The local population was a mix of Muslims and a small community of Christians. The modern story of Jericho and the rediscovery of its incredible ancient past began in the 19th century. As European colonial and academic interest in the Orient grew, a new kind of visitor arrived, the archaeologist and the biblical scholar. They came to the Holy Land looking for physical evidence to confirm the stories of the Bible. The large, prominent mound of Tel Sultan, the site of ancient Jericho, naturally attracted their attention. The first major excavations began in the 1860s and continued with various expeditions over the next several decades. Early archaeologists like Charles Warren and Ant Sellen began to dig into the mound, revealing the tops of walls and finding pottery. But their methods were crude by modern standards. They were often treasure hunters, digging tunnels and deep trenches in search of impressive finds, without carefully recording the context of what they found. The true revolution in understanding Jericho's history came with the work of British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon. From 1952 to 1958, she led a major expedition to Tel Es Sultan. Kenyon was a meticulous scientist. She introduced a new excavation method to the region, known as the Wheeler-Kenyon method. This involved digging in small, carefully measured squares, leaving balks, walls of earth, between them. These balks preserved a vertical record of the layers, or strata, like a slice of a layered cake. By studying the pottery and objects in each layer, she could build a precise timeline of the site's occupation. It was Kenyon who definitively uncovered the mind-boggling deep history of Jericho. She identified the pre-pottery Neolithic A settlement, with its stone wall and massive tower. She found the plastered skulls. She was able to clearly separate the different layers of the Bronze Age and Iron Age. Her work proved, beyond a doubt, that Jericho was one of the oldest continuously inhabited sites in the world, with a history stretching back over 10,000 years. She transformed our understanding of the site from a biblical footnote to the foundational chapter in the story of human civilization. Her work established Jericho not just as the oldest city, but as a unique window into the moment when humanity began its journey toward urban life. Jericho today, a living city and an ancient treasure today. Jericho is a Palestinian city in the West Bank, with a population of over 20,000 people. It is a modern, functioning city with schools, shops, and homes. But it lives simultaneously in the present and the deep past. The ancient Tel Es Sultan, the mound of the original city, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a protected archaeological park that lies just to the north of the modern city center. Visitors can walk among the ruins and see the exposed layers of walls from different eras, the stone tower from 9000 BCE, the mud brick walls of the Bronze Age, and the simple Israelite houses from the Iron Age. It is a powerful experience to stand in one place and see the physical remains of 10 millennia of human history. The Ain e Sultan Spring still flows, just as it has for thousands of years, though it is now channeled and managed to provide water for the modern city's needs. The city's economy is still heavily based on agriculture, with vast plantations of date palms, banana trees, and citrus groves covering the oasis, creating a sea of green in the dry valley. Tourism is also a major industry. People come from all over the world to see the oldest city in the world, to ride the cable car up the Mount of Temptation, where Jesus is said to have fasted for 40 days, and to visit the site of Herod's winter palace and the nearby Hisham's palace, the spectacular Umayyad ruins. The story of Jericho is the story of resilience. It is a story of a location so perfect, so essential, that humans have been drawn to it again and again for over 10,000 years. It has been a hunter-gatherer's camp, a Neolithic town with the world's first tower, a mighty Canaanite city-state, an Israelite town, a royal winter resort for Herod, a pilgrimage stop for Byzantines and Crusaders, and a modest Ottoman village. It has been destroyed by earthquakes, fire, and war, and each time it has been rebuilt. Its history forces us to rethink what a city is. Was it a city in the Neolithic period, with its thousands of inhabitants, its massive wall, and its social complexity, even before the invention of pottery? Most archaeologists would say yes. Jericho challenges our definitions and pushes back the timeline of urbanism. It shows us that the human impulse to come together, to build a community, to defend it, and to create a shared culture and identity is an ancient and powerful force. The story of Jericho is, in many ways, the opening chapter of our own story, the story of how we became who we are. It is a story that began with a simple, life-giving spring in a group of people who decided to call it home. Thank you for listening. Consider subscribing to History Sleep Stories. Good night.